Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break.
Hey, good evening, everybody. This is Ben Powers, Commander from the Commander's Voice. I'm really excited to be back on the air. It's been about a month since I've done a recording. My day job and life kind of got in the way, but I'm back with another video book review. For my second video book review, I'm going to be reviewing Terry C. Treadwell's A Strike from the Air, which is about the early days of the United States Army Air Service. It focuses on pre-World War I, World War I, and a little bit after World War I. World War I is when Army aviation really started coming into its own, for a variety of nations, not just the United States. So that takes up the bulk of the book. But the book does talk about World War I Army aviation efforts. In 1891, the Army Signal Corps, my old corps, started a balloon section based off lessons learned during the Civil War and post-Civil War era, both in the United States and in Europe, on how balloons could be used to gain an advantage to observe enemy troop movements, see behind the lines, and feed the intelligence picture. When the Wright brothers started having success with heavier than air flight, the military utility of powered aircraft started to come to its own. So they were used for observation in the early days of the First World War, and soon ground troops became aware of the fact that they were vulnerable to the observations from these aircraft and started trying to engage them. So then the aircraft started having to become armed to protect itself. And thus, in a very short period of time, from 1914 to 1918, you saw an evolution of the air service from primarily an unarmed observation role, to not only an armed observation role, but a role of other aircraft protecting observation aircraft, whether they be powered or balloons, pursuing other armed aircraft to keep them off the observation aircraft, and also the development of aircraft for strategic bombing. Mr. Treadwell goes into all of that. Now, when I was a young man, I was a real big fan of a book by a gentleman named Gene Gurney called Flying Aces of World War I. It was a landmark book. It came out in 1965. I probably read it in the early 80s. And I was just fascinated with the romance of the idea of the World War I flying ace with the scarf and the open cockpit, the biplane, the leather helmet, the whole deal. And Treadwell goes a very long way to dispelling those myths of romance. It's very cold at altitude, especially in an open cockpit. You're flying, although the aircraft were marvels of engineering for their time, they were still built out of wood and cloth, and compared to 21st century aircraft, they certainly weren't very sturdy. Initially, pilots and observers were not equipped with parachutes. So, it quickly became a very perilous proposition to be up there flying around. And so fear was a constant companion, as well as the cold, the noise from the engine, the castor oil coming off the engine, fumes, just not a very romantic or comfortable existence. Probably preferable to living in a trench, but at the same time, not what a lot of books kind of paint that life to be, sort of the Knights of the Air kind of thing. But still a really fascinating book. As people would expect, Strike from the Air goes into the heroes of American aviation, prior to the United States entering into the First World War. A lot of Americans traveled to France to volunteer their services with the French because they wanted to get into the fight, and they kind of viewed the Allies as the good guys and the Germans and Austria-Hungary as the Central Powers as the bad guys. A lot of folks volunteered to serve in the French Foreign Legion, and eventually they transitioned out of fighting with the infantry into trying to get into the air service, to the point where the French created the Lafayette Escadrille, which was a French aviation squadron manned by Americans. And you have heroes like Eugene Bullard, one of two African American combat aviators in World War I, who first had great success as a combat infantryman in the French Foreign Legion, or a gentleman named Raoul Lufberry, who was a highly decorated pilot in first the French and then the American Air Service before he lost his life in World War I. And the book goes into detail about the Lafayette Escadrille and the exploits of those men. Then after 1917, when the United States gets into the war, you start having heroes like Eddie Rickenbacker, who was the most decorated and the highest scoring American ace of World War I with 26 aerial victories. His story's told. I'm wearing the shirt of the 94th Aerial Squadron today, right here, the Hat and the Ring Squadron, in honor of Eddie Rickenbacker. They go into talking about Frank Luke from the 27th Aerial Squadron, who was the balloon buster, a very young man. He died in September of 1918 in combat at 21 years of age, but he'd already had 18 aerial victories, 14 against balloons and 4 against manned aircraft. And he was known as the balloon buster. He was a Medal of Honor recipient. So those stories, which you'd expect because they're like the heroes of the nascent Army aviation back in the day. He definitely talks about Billy Mitchell, and as aviation grew during the war, Billy Mitchell was the American Expeditionary Force aviation officer who had a vision of an independent air service that he pursued after the war. The book goes into detail talking about his formative experiences during World War I. A couple of things that the book goes into, which I found was fascinating and was a little bit different, is Treadwell does not neglect the United States Navy. He talks about developments in naval aviation. He talks about naval air stations that were established in England and the Mediterranean during the war, and the support they provided to seaborne convoys, and the advantages of having aerial eyes in support of a fleet. He has 2 chapters, a pre-war and a World War I chapter that focuses on those, which are amazing. He includes a chapter which discusses the escape stories of pilots who were down behind enemy lines, and he goes into detail sharing the after-action reviews of the reports that those pilots and observers made to the authorities when they got back behind friendly lines about their experiences. And probably the most interesting to me, he talks about the Polish-Soviet War, which happened between 1919 and 1921, when American aviators who had served in the Army Air Service actually formed a squadron in support of the Polish forces to fight against the Soviets along the lines of Lafayette Escadrille. I didn't know anything about that story. And they created a squadron called give me a second, the Kosciuszko Squadron, named after Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who was a Polish officer during the American Revolution who offered his services to the nascent United States, kind of like Lafayette did from France. Kosciuszko did the same thing from Poland, and he was a very talented military engineer, and he made a lot of great contributions to the United States. And the squadron kind of saw them repaying those contributions to Poland. Had no idea these guys even fought, much less that there was even a Polish-Soviet war that took place after World War I. So that was a very fascinating chapter of the book. The book itself comes in at about 300 pages. It's published by Pen and Sword. It has some excellent appendices, and it's a very short bibliography, and I highly recommend it. So once again, Strike from the Air, The Early Years of the United States Air Forces by Mr. Terry C. Treadwell. I highly recommend it. So thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you guys again on the Commander's Voice soon. Thank you.